From KVUE News in Austin, you're watching Texas This Week with Ashley Goodo.
Good Sunday morning. Congressman Michael McCaul, who represents parts of Central Texas, is back in the United States after leading a bipartisan delegation of lawmakers to Taiwan. We're talking about his trip and how a Chinese invasion could impact the United States. But first, let's look at the 3 things you need to know in Texas politics. The stage is set for a battle of the chambers in the Texas Capitol. This week, the House of Representatives passed its property tax relief bill. House Bill 2 by Representative Morgan Meyer would lower the property appraisal cap from 10% to 5%. That means no matter how much your property appraisal increases, the value that you actually pay taxes on could only increase by 5%. And that would be the case for all property in Texas, including businesses and rental homes. Lawmakers say homeowners would save anywhere between $540 and $735 over the next 2 years. But last month, the Senate passed SB 3. It would increase the homestead property tax exemption, the portion of a house's value that cannot be taxed, from $40,000 to $70,000. And homeowners 65 and older or disabled would get a $100,000 exemption. That's estimated to save the owner of a $300,000 home about $664 a year, $795 a year for those who are disabled and seniors. Both plans compress the school tax rate, but that's about the only similarity. And the leaders of each chamber think their plan is what's best for Texans.
I don't like to be argumentative. I don't like to say the speaker is wrong in his plan, but the facts are the facts.
There have been 140 ayes in 9 days. HA 01 is finally passed. That too should send a message, Mr. Meyer.
The Texas House Committee that looks into alleged misconduct by lawmakers issued 4 subpoenas Friday. The Committee on General Investigating has not said who those subpoenas are for or what they are regarding, but complaints against 2 representatives have made headlines this session. A staffer submitted a complaint alleging Representative Brian Slayton had an inappropriate relationship with an intern who is under the age of 21. And last month, 3 of Representative Yolanda Jones's staffers resigned, saying she created a, quote, abusive and hostile work environment. On Thursday, the Senate passed a $15 million bill to expand mental health services in Texas. Senate Bill 26 creates a grant program to build new hospitals, increasing the number of mental health hospital beds, and would give funding to groups that work with families and children considered high risk for mental conditions. The bill now heads to the House. U.S. Representative Michael McCaul, chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and a bipartisan group of lawmakers are sending a message to China. Don't invade Taiwan. The exclamation point? A trip to the Pacific Islands to meet with leaders and going into Taiwan despite warnings from China. We caught up with the congressman when he returned to America. You just returned from a trip to Taiwan where there's some escalating tension with China. Tell us about your trip.
You know, it was a really fascinating and a very historic moment. We traveled to our Indo-PACOM, which is our, basically our naval command in the Pacific, to get briefed. Went to Japan, met with the Prime Minister, South Korea with President, and then President Tsai in Taiwan. We were warned by Communist China by email not to visit, and then when we did, we saw an escalation of warships and airplanes, fighter jets. By the time we left the island, it was surrounded by about 11 battleships and about 70 fighter jets on the island. So it was a bit of an intimidating experience, but we were not going to let that deter us. It was a bipartisan trip to show our support for Taiwan.
And so let's take a step back for some of our viewers who just may not be following what's happening. We particularly saw some issues with China and Taiwan after Taiwan's president met with U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy here in California, here in the United States, but in California. Talk to us about what happened.
Right. So President Tsai, President of Taiwan, visited the United States, met with Speaker McCarthy. China expressed its displeasure with that, just like when Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan, in country in Taiwan. But, she has every right to visit us in the United States, and we have every right to visit Taiwanese officials in Taiwan. It's really this aggressive behavior on the part of Communist China that we're concerned about, and they're very concerned about this in Taiwan. I sign off on all foreign military weapon sales. We've yet to get those into Taiwan to provide deterrence. We have some combat training. But I think at the end of the day, Ashley, it's trying to get Chairman Xi to think twice about invading Taiwan because the price may be too high for him. And that's the kind of deterrence that we need in the region. That's why we met with our Pacific partners as well, and that being Japan, South Korea. The Philippines are one of those as well as Australia, to deter aggression through strength rather than projecting weakness, which will invite aggression.
We saw what happened with Russia and what's happening with Russia and Ukraine and the involvement that China has with Russia. Do you feel like this is really going to be a deterrent, or are Chinese leaders going to do what they want to do?
Well, we worry that Chairman Xi's been very clear of his intentions on talking to his own Congress about what he calls reunification of Taiwan with China. And that would involve a blockade or a military invasion. I personally think they're going to try to influence the election next January to get their candidate elected, kind of like Hong Kong without a shot fired. But if they're not successful, I think they will look at the military, option. And, after Afghanistan fell the way it did, I think it projected weakness. You saw Putin invade Ukraine, and we know that he's always wanted to do that. And I think Chairman Xi's always had intentions on the Pacific. And I worry that if he goes into Taiwan, his aggression could go beyond that to the island chain that you see in that part of the world. And I think deterrence is really going to be important right now to stop this kind of behavior. And some ask, why is Taiwan important? Well, about 90% of the advanced semiconductor chips are manufactured in Taiwan, which is why, I introduced and passed the Chips for America Act to pull the supply chain out of Taiwan, which is very vulnerable to China. But if Communist China either owns or breaks the global manufacturing for advanced semiconductor chips, you can imagine the weak position we would be in and how badly that would be for the global economy.
Do you have any ideas on a timeline as to when China could make a move if it intends to do that? That you can tell us, obviously.
A lot of experts say they throw out the year 2027 based on some intelligence, which I personally think it could happen sooner. I think, again, they're going to try to influence the election of January 2024. And if they're not successful at that, then I think they may move on a faster timeline. And I think more experts are kind of coming around to that way of thinking, that it could happen, after January 2024, possibly between the transition of power in the presidential elections, our presidential elections. That's why I think getting the deterrence in now in terms of the weapons that they've purchased 3 years ago is so important. But also let it known that Chairman Xi is going to come at a very high economic price as well.
Now it is time for my Bill of the Week, the Texas This Week segment where I highlight different pieces of legislation that catch my eye. And this morning, I have some good news to report. Last session, back in 2021, Representative Retta Bowers from Garland filed a bill to ban discrimination based on hair texture and protective hairstyles associated with race. The Crown Act, which stands for Creating a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair. Time ran out on the bill last session and it died on the House floor. This time around, that didn't happen. In fact, this week, the House overwhelmingly passed HB 567 with just 3 lawmakers voting against it on the initial vote. So the bill is 1/3 of the way to the finish line. I'm sure there are people out there who don't think this bill is necessary or think, what's the big deal? But day after day, Black women and men are told that we can't wear our hair the way it grows out of our heads, that we need to change our hair texture or style our hair in ways that damage our crowns in order to be accepted or professional. It happens in the workplace, it happens in schools, it happens more often than you may think. It's happened to me, and when it comes to viewer emails, it still happens. So for some of us, this bill would create more than just a law that says you can't discriminate against us for our God-given hair. It's a declaration that Black women and men not only belong in all spaces, but the things that make us unique are to be celebrated, not altered under a guise of what's acceptable. So, one chamber down, one to go. Senate, you're up.